In the winter of 1530, a man sat alone in a stone farmhouse outside Florence, ruined. He had no office, no income, no title, stripped of everything after the Medici'd power and had him arrested, tortured on the rack, exiled to a small plot of land he could barely farm. By any reasonable measure, Niccolò Machiavelli was finished, and yet, in the evenings, after a day spent bickering with woodcutters and playing cards in a tavern, he would go home, wash off the dust of a wasted day, put on his finest robes, alone, and sit down to write to the most powerful men in Italy, men who wanted nothing to do with him. He was not writing a memoir. He was not writing a complaint. He was manual for acquiring power and wealth from a position of absolute zero. And the strange part is that the book worked. Not for him, not immediately, but the ideas inside it would go on to explain, with uncomfortable precision, how fortunes are actually built, not through virtue, not through luck, through 4 specific, repeatable moves that most people are too proud or too frightened to make. Machiavelli wrote The Prince not as philosophy for its own sake, but as a survival document, a desperate, calculated bid to be useful again to the men who had cast him out. Buried inside that desperation, though, is a cold, transferable logic about how people move from nothing to something. By the end of this video, you'll understand the 4 mechanisms he identified, and why one of them, the one modern people avoid the most, is usually the actual difference between staying at zero and not to understand where these rules come from. You have to understand who Machiavelli was watching when he wrote them. For 14 years, from 1490 to 1512, he served the Florentine Republic as a diplomat and civil servant. Not a nobleman, not a wealthy man, but a functionary sent to observe the courts of Europe and report back. In 1502, that job put him in the same room, repeatedly, with a man named Cesare Borgia. Borgia was the illegitimate son of a pope, which in the brutal arithmetic of Renaissance Italy meant he started with a connection but no legitimate to anything, no army own, no territory, no inherited throne. Within a few short years, using a combination of borrowed papal troops, ruthless political timing, and the calculated murder of rivals who had briefly served him, Borgia carved out an entire principality in the Romagna region. Machiavelli watched this happen at close range, took detailed notes, and later used Borgia, not some ancient king, not an abstraction, as the closest thing the prince has to a working case study. It's worth being precise here. Machiavelli was not naively worshipping Borgia. He documents his cruelty plainly, including the infamous execution of his own lieutenant, Rimiro d'Orco, staged in a public square to redirect popular anger away from Borgia himself. What fascinated Machiavelli was not the morality of the man, but the mechanics. How someone with no inherited wealth converted borrowed resources, timing, and controlled violence into a functioning state in under a decade. That case study, stripped its most extreme elements, is where 3 of the 4 rules in this video originate. The 4th comes from a quieter, more patient source, the Medici banking family itself, the very dynasty that just destroyed Machiavelli's career. Core framework. The first rule Machiavelli extracts from Borgia's is this: see the field exactly as it is, not as you wish it were. Machiavelli breaks explicitly from every political writer who described ideal states run by ideal rulers. He states bluntly that he intends to write about the effectual truth of the world rather than an imagined one, because a man who insists on acting as though people are basically good will be destroyed by the many who are not. Applied to wealth specifically, this means Borgia never wasted energy resenting the fact that legitimate princes had inherited what he had to build. He simply catalogued what those princes actually had: armies, alliances, weaknesses, and planned around the world as it existed. Most people who stay at zero do the opposite. They spend their limited energy being angry that the game is unfair, that other people started 10 steps ahead, that the market rewards the wrong things, and that anger, however justified, is not a strategy. It's a leak. Think about the last financial decision you made purely out of frustration rather than calculation, a job you quit in anger, a purchase made to prove a point. That's tax an unclear picture of reality charges you, and it's the first thing Borgia refused to pay. This leads to the second, more dangerous pattern. Virtue answers fortune, and fortune never waits. Machiavelli's concept of virtù, often mistranslated simply as virtue, but he means something closer: decisive force, the capacity to act hard and fast the moment an opening appears, rather than waiting for perfect conditions. He famously compares fortune to a river that floods unpredictably. The fool builds nothing and is swept away, while the prepared man's dikes and channels in advance, so that when the flood comes, he can direct it rather than drown in it. Borgia's entire rise depended on exploiting a single, narrow window: the years his father sat on the papal throne, controlling troops and alliances Borgia could borrow but not yet own outright. He knew the window would close the moment his father died, and it did, but by then he had already used it to seize the Romagna. Consider the modern equivalent: a narrow opening at work, shifting for 18 months before competitors notice, a skill gap only you currently know how to fill. Most people wait for certainty before acting, and certainty, structurally, only arrives after the opportunity is gone. And this is exactly where the story pivots. Because the deeper the video goes, the more the frame around the visuals themselves settles, the way a man's posture settles once the decision has already been made and only the consequences remain to unfold. The third principle moves away from Borgia's speed and towards something slower. Reputation is the first currency, and it must be built before real money arrives. This is where the Medici, ironically, prove Machiavelli's own point better than Borgia does. Cosimo de' Medici, who built the foundation of the family's banking fortune in the early 1400s, did not begin by flaunting wealth. He deliberately dressed modestly, funded public buildings and churches under other men's names, and avoided titles that would mark him as a threat to Florence's other powerful families. He understood something Machiavelli would later put into words explicitly: that a ruler, or a rising man of any kind, needs to be perceived as trustworthy and formidable simultaneously, because perception is what people extend credit against, literally and socially, before they have any hard proof you deserve it. The psychological mechanism underneath this is simple. Humans allocate resources, opportunities, and trust based on the story they've already built about a person in their heads, updated slowly and reluctantly. Cosimo spent 2 decades curating that story before the Medici Bank became the most powerful financial institution in Europe. In your own life, this shows up as the difference between the person who talks about their ambitions loudly before they've delivered anything, and the one who quietly becomes the person people go to first. Because this second version has been depositing trust into an account that compounds long before any money does. The fourth and final principle is the one Machiavelli states most bluntly, and the one people avoid the most today: never build your fortune on resources you don't actually control. In The Prince, Machiavelli devotes an entire chapter to warning against mercenary and auxiliary armies, soldiers borrowed or hired from someone else's command. Because a prince who depends on troops that ultimately answer to another has built his power on a foundation he can lose the instant that other master changes his mind. Borgia lived this warning firsthand. Nearly all of his early conquests were made possible by his father's papal army. And when Pope Alexander VI died in 503, that borrowed foundation within months, and so did most of what Borgia had built. The lesson is not never use anyone else's resources. Early leverage almost always requires it. The lesson is that at some point, the borrowed engine has to be converted into something you actually own outright. Your own client relationships, your own capital, your own reputation independent of the person who first opened the door for you. The Medici understood this too. They used political favor to gain their first major contracts, but by the mid-1800s had built an actual branch network, actual trained managers, and actual capital reserves that didn't depend on any single pope or prince staying in power. Picture the version of this in an ordinary career. The person who builds real skill and an independent client list during their first job versus the person who builds nothing but internal politics. The first person survives being fired. The second person's entire foundation disappears the day their sponsor does. Underneath all four rules sits a single, harder idea that Machiavelli never states directly, but that the whole of The Prince assumes. Fortune only ever hands you the opening. It never hands you the outcome. Borgia and Cosimo de' Medici, almost nothing in common as men. One was fast, violent, and impatient. The other was patient, restrained, and quiet for decades. And yet Machiavelli extracts the same underlying logic from both of them. Because the logic isn't about temperament. It's about the refusal to mistake circumstance for destiny in either direction. It's worth being honest about the limits of this framework, too. Machiavelli wrote in an era with almost no social safety net, minimal legal protection for the poor, and a level of casual political violence that makes his advice, taken too literally, genuinely dangerous rather than merely ruthless. The version worth extracting for a modern life is eliminate your rivals. It's the underlying discipline of clear-eyed assessment, decisive timing, patient reputation building, and ownership, which apply with none of the bloodshed attached. The counterargument worth sitting with honestly is that not everyone starts at the same zero. Borgia had a pope for a father, and Cosimo inherited a functioning bank from his own father, Giovanni. Zero is rarely absolute, but the mechanisms they used from that starting point are still the mechanisms, regardless of how far back that starting point actually was. Start with an audit, not a plan. Before you decide what to build, write down, plainly, without softening it, 3 resources you currently do not control that your current income or status depends on. A single client, a single employer's goodwill, a single platform's algorithm, a single relationship. That list is your version of Borgia's borrowed papal army, and naming it precisely is the first move. Because anxiety about instability is not the same as a specific, addressable liability. Then pick exactly one of those 3 and spend the next 90 days converting it into something you own outright. A second client relationship built independently. A skill certified under your own name rather than your employer's. A small audience or reputation that exists outside any single platform's rules. After 90 days, check the honest question. If the resource on your list disappeared tomorrow, would the new thing you built actually hold your position, even partially? If the answer is still no, You haven't finished the conversion. You've just moved the dependency somewhere else and called it progress. Machiavelli died in 1527, still relatively poor, having never fully regained the political standing he'd lost. By the narrow measure of his own life, the man who wrote the most influential guide to acquiring power never quite acquired it back for himself. But that farmhouse outside Florence, where a ruined man put on his best clothes every night to write for an audience that had rejected him, produced something that outlived every fortune Cesare Borgia ever seized and lost within a decade. The window Borgia used closed the moment his father died, because he never converted what was borrowed into what was his. Machiavelli's ideas never closed, because he built them from nothing but discipline and observation, the one form of ownership that can't be repossessed by anyone else's death, or anyone else's change of heart. The four rules were never really about Renaissance princes. They were about the uncomfortable difference between people who wait for the field to be fair, and people who read the field exactly as it is and move anyway. If there's one thing worth taking from a ruined man's farmhouse 1513, it's that clarity, reputation, and ownership were available to him at absolute zero. And they're available if you're willing to build the way he actually did, rather than the way this world tells you power is supposed to look. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, subscribe. Because the next study in this pattern of power is exactly the kind of thing worth understanding before